What you can see right here is just a simple example, but now let's add more things onto it, because later on we're going to exchange callback functions for both promises and async await. To complicate it, we're going to imagine that we are working on a social media platform of sorts. Once the user profile is fetched, then we want to fetch his photos, so let's create a function for that. So now we have the const fetch user, but just below, let's create another one. Const fetch user photos. And then in there, it's also going to be a function. It's going to accept username as a parameter and also the callback function. We're going to do the same thing we did above. I can even copy that set timeout function. So we have something happening after 2 seconds. And then what we're going to do here is instead of sending back the user, we're going to send back an array that contains the photos. So in here, I can say an array of string 1, which is going to say photo 1, and then another string in there, which is going to be photo 2. We're just going to mock it, no real photos here. Just below our sets timeout, in here, I'm going to create a console log that's going to say, now we have the photos, just like that. Okay, and I can even put it in square brackets so it's more noticeable. And I'm going to copy that console log and also put it at the top of our fetch user, because in there, we also want to say, now we have the user. So now what is happening is we are fetching user, and only after the user is fetched, then we want to fetch his photos. Since this is a demo example, we have one inconsistency here, and that is that technically we could be calling both the fetch user and fetch user photos at the same time because they don't depend on something. But in real case scenario, you would first have to authenticate the user and then based on his authentication key, for example, fetch the actual photos. But for simplicity purposes, what we're doing here is we are fetching each thing after another. So only after the fetch user is done, only then are we fetching the photos and everything else. Right now, we are back where we were. We're just calling the fetch user, but we're not doing anything with fetch user photos. So how can we put that into play? Well, we're going to call that only after the user is fetched. Remember this console log here, and that is happening inside of the fetch user callback function. So now just inside of there, we can call our second function, fetch user photos, just like that. We have to pass in the username, and we also have to pass in a callback function. So I'm going to create one like this, and then in there, we have to fetch some things. In this case, that's going to be user photos. How do we know that user photos are in there? Because if you take a look in here in the callback function, we are passing in the user photos as the one and only parameter. And that's the same thing here. This is the callback function. This is the one and only parameter, and it is the user photos. Now let's console log these photos. We're going to do the same thing we did before, console log, and then something like your photos are, and then in there, user photos. And one small thing I noticed in here, we should be sending the user.username and not only the username because we don't have access to it. Our username is stored only after we fetch the specific user, and then we have it under the user.username. Now, if we save that, take a look. First, after 2 seconds, we get now we have the user, your name is Michael, and then after 2 seconds after that, we have now we have the photos. Your photos are photo 1 and photo 2. So now something is happening in succession, one thing after another. You can see this username here is grayed out, which means that we are not using it. So now we can say now we have the photos for, and then in there we can say username. So basically we are saying we have the photos for which user, just so we can make use of that username. Great. Now let's save it one more time to see what's happening. We wait 2 seconds. Now we have the user, your name is Michael. And then now we have the photos for Michael. Great. So we have to get the user and then we get the images for the user. As you can see, we have a lot of code here, more than we've written in some sections of the course so far. This is already getting messy. Let's add just one more function and you'll easily notice the problem. Now that we have the photos, let's create one more thing, and that is fetch photo details. You know how on Facebook, for example, or in other social media platforms, each photo has its own title, description, and so on. So let's just mock that, create a demo code for that. So just below, I'm going to create another function, which is going to be called const fetch photo details. That's again going to be equal to a function. That function is going to accept a photo, a singular photo, and a callback function. In there, we again have the same thing, the set timeout, which waits 2 seconds. In here, we can say now we have the photo details. So let's do that. We have the photo details for the photo, and then in here we can add photo because that's going to be the name of the actual image. What do we want to pass over? Well, in this case, it's simply going to be a string that says details. We don't actually have to think about the username, description, or stuff like that. We're just passing over details. Now, as you might have already figured, we are doing everything one after another. So in here, after we get the photos, only then do we want to actually try to fetch the photo details. So in this case, that's going to be fetch photo details. And then in this case, since our fetch photo details accepts one photo, let's, for example, pass in only the first photo. So that's going to be user photos and then 0, because we want to pass only the first element in the array. And then the second parameter is a callback function, as always. And then in there, we have details. Now, after we do that, we can say console log, also a template string, and we can say your photo details are, and then in there we have the access to the details variable. Now, if we save the code, let's see what is happening. We wait 2 seconds, then we get access to Michael, then after 2 seconds we get Michael's photos, and then we have the details for photo 1, your photo details are details. Now we're doing 3 asynchronous actions, one after another, and each one is dependent on the previous one. For that reason, we're calling the fetch photo details inside of the fetch user photos, which is being called inside of the fetch user. Functions inceptions happening here, a lot of weird things. And our code is starting to look a bit weird, if you'd agree. If we remove these console logs right now and space this out like this, take a look what's happening. As you can see, if we use callbacks, we get this weird structure that just keeps moving to the right. If I just add a few more functions, take a look. We added a few more callbacks, and this is how our code would look like. This is called callback hell, and basically it becomes unreadable. Let me write that right there. The infamous callback hell. That's it. Our code just gets this weird triangle-like structure to the indentation. In this code, we can see on the left side, there's a triangle-like structure to the indentation, and this is infamously known as the callback hell. So what callbacks include is, in short, every function in here gets an argument to another function, that is this thing, and then one to another, to another, to another, and we just keep moving to the right side. It's difficult to manage a lot of callback functions. Even if you wrote them yourself, you're going to have a hard time understanding them once you come back to the code after some time. This pattern of coding, more specifically callbacks, at a large scale is not maintainable, and it is confusing and also violates the dry principle, don't repeat yourself, and hence it is a bad practice to follow. So, to resolve this issue, JavaScript introduced the concept of promises. In the next video, you're going to fully understand how promises work, and we're going to refactor this code to use promises. Stay tuned.